Today's lecturer, Professor Jeffrey Gurock, is the Libby M. Kaplan Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University. From 1982 to 2002, he was the Associate Editor of American Jewish History, the leading academic journal in his field. He's also twice served as chair of the Academic Council of the American Jewish Historical Society. He is the author or editor of 17 books, if I've added them up correctly. His works include Modern Heretic and a Traditional Community, Mordecai M. Kaplan, Orthodoxy and and American Judaism. This book won the 1998 Best Book Award from the American Jewish Historical Society. His book, Orthodox Jews in America, was a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award in the area of American Jewish Studies. His most recent book, Jews in Gotham, New York Jews in a Changing City, received the Everett Family Foundation Award for the Best Nonfiction Jewish Book of 2012 from the Jewish Book Council. In addition, I've learned of his vast administrative experience at Yeshiva. So he combines excellence both in scholarship, in teaching, as well as service to the academy through academic administrative leadership. So it's our honor and pleasure to welcome him to the U of A. His lecture today is entitled Religious Values of American Jews. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gurock.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. How happy am I to be in Arizona at this time of year? You're about 80 degrees wind chill warmer than my home in New York. You'll immediately notice my distinctive New York dialect that informs the way I speak. It's interesting that I'm speaking here at U of A. One of my colleagues, one of the more esteemed professors of American Jewish history, Leonard Dinstein, taught American Jewish history for many years. And I see him as a mentor, as a colleague, as a friend. And when I was thinking about this talk, it dawned upon me that in many respects, what interests me is the opposite of what interested Leonard. Leonard is and was known as perhaps the most important scholar of American anti-Semitism, who looked at the difficulties Jews faced in gaining acceptance in America. My work is really the opposite. My work deals with the questions of Jewish identity. How do you maintain a Jewish identity in a country which more often than not has been accepting of Jews? So he's looking at the downside and the implications of the downside through anti-Semitism. I'm looking at the upside of acceptance and many of the difficulties of maintaining Jewish identity since 1654 when Jews arrived in this country. So we're going to walk through some aspects of American Jewish history using the document that I handed out to you, a few excerpts. But let me just say two other things about studying American Judaism. About 25 years ago, one of my colleagues wrote that when he started studying the history of Jewish religion, practice, observance, and ideology in America, a senior colleague told him the following: all you need to know about American Jewish history is the following. They come to America, they abandon their faith, they begin to live like the Goyim, the Gentiles, and after a generation they all intermarried and all disappeared. That is American Jewish history. All the rest is commentary. So don't waste your time, go study the Talmud. So there is a certain degree of dismissiveness about the American Jewish experience, which some of us for the last three generations, with Leonard in the middle of that periodization, have tried to say there's a complexity and important aspect to American Jewish history that should be studied. Now, the truth is, intermarriage has been a problem, is a problem, but just to say they all intermarried does not begin to look at the complexity of the American Jewish experience. So Leonard is not here, but let me begin with the first event in American Jewish history and see a very, very different aspect to it the way I tell it. So the first event in American Jewish history takes place in the fall of 1654, where 23 Jews arrived from Brazil. We used to think there were 23, they may be 25, they may be 26, be that as it may. And Peter Stuyvesant does not want them in the colony Many of you know the story, and one of the things he says that's very crucial, he says, is that if we let Jews in, the next thing we'll have papists and Lutherans, Catholics and Lutherans. And that's important because those, as Leonard has pointed out, those who do not like Jews very often do not like Catholics and Lutherans. And in fact, without digressing too much, if you look at the history of America through the 18th and 19th century, Catholics have more problems with the Protestant majority than do Jews, having a lot to do with the small numbers of Jews in the United States. In any event, after a great deal of discussion back and forth between Amsterdam and New Amsterdam, Peter Stuyvesant is forced to let these 23 or more Jews come to the colony. 10 years later, when the British move up the Hudson and take over the colony, Peter Stuyvesant has almost gotten his wish. Almost everyone leaves. Almost everyone, we're talking about 23 some odd Jews. Why do they leave? Because they have great difficulty maintaining any sort of economic profile within this very poor colony. My work starts with a very different aspect. The 2 or 3 people who stay are significant to me. Solomon Peterson, Jew, comes early, intermarries right away, and is lost to the Jewish community. The other family that stays is the family of Asher and Miriam Levy. In fact, if you visit my hometown on 23rd Street, which at that point was a rural area, New York City was only as far north as Wall Street, you would find out that there's an Asher Levy Park. Asher Levy stays because he has a lucrative profession. He's a butcher, and a butcher can make a living in New Amsterdam. What interested me about Levy is how he maintained his life as a Jew. He and his wife Miriam, and I identified Miriam through his will, the probated will identifies her for the first time. In many respects, he and she are one of the few Jews in the world in the 17th century who are living outside any sort of Jewish community. They are not dissenters like Benedict Spinoza might be in Holland. They're living apart from the Jewish community. So what do we know about him? What do we know? Some people have said that Asher Levy was a traditional Jew, and they base it upon a paucity of source material, a number of sources from his probated will, which indicate that, apart from the fact that he had many sets of clothing, he had a sword, he had a hat, and things of that sort, they had multiple dishes in the inventory. There was a Sabbath lamp and a Kiddush cup. So people have said, okay, you have those 3 things, that makes him an Orthodox Jew. Well, I look at it more critically. Many of us have multiple sets of dishes. When the Stanwicks or the Van Cortlands came to dinner in New Amsterdam, maybe they brought out the bone china. It doesn't necessarily mean he's traditional or not. The same thing with a Sabbath lamp. Who knows who turned it on, who turned it off? What I'm indicating to you is there's a story to be told, a complex story to be told about the first 2 Jews in America, how in fact they maintained their lives. And that's some of the things we'll be talking about this afternoon as we go along. The other thing that's interested me, and Professor Wright was nice enough to mention that I wrote a book called Orthodox Jews in America, which is soon to be a major motion picture, is that most historians who write about Orthodoxy often divide the community between those who are observant and those who are not observant. And the rubrics that they use are such things as, do these Jews observe the Sabbath in a traditional way? What about the kosher laws? What about the family purity laws? And this dichotomy between those who observe and those who do not observe is seen as the way of defining who's Orthodox and who's Jewish in the United States. So we're going to look at some complexities here through source materials, but first I want to tell a personal story with which I opened my Orthodoxy book. So I grew up in the East Bronx. Again, you can tell that I grew up in the East Bronx in the 1950s. My family belonged to an Orthodox synagogue. So bear with me. There was a gentleman who sat in the second row next to my father, who was revered by everyone. He had the following very traditional religious values. First of all, He and his wife were very charitable beyond their means, which is a very important mitzvah, commandment. They scrimped and saved to send their son, but not their daughter, to day school, which is sort of interesting. If you walked into their home on Saturday afternoon, as the day grew dark, their modest apartment grew dark because they wouldn't turn on the lights, and they didn't have what's known as a Sabbath clock, a clock that turns on and off the lights, sort of like Asa Levi had that Sabbath lamp, which he may or may not have used. They never ate outside their home. They were always kosher eaters. There were no kosher restaurants in the neighborhood. His favorite recreational activity was attending the rabbi's Talmud class. This is one devout Orthodox Jew eating kosher, studying. His greatest regret is that when he went to the Talmud class, he didn't know as much as some of the other people who weren't the beneficiaries of a profound Jewish education. There's only one problem to his story, and that is he worked in the garment center in the 30s in Manhattan. And on many weekends, on many Sabbaths, or when there is a Jewish holiday, like Passover is coming in a month or so, there'll be a 3-day holiday for traditional observers, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. He would absent himself from the synagogue. He went to work. So what in the world do we do with this person in terms of his religious values? If you think from a Jewish legal point of view, Judaism 101, the Bible says there are 2 prohibitions with reference to the Sabbath. One is thou shalt not work, and the second, thou shalt not light a fire on the Sabbath day. But let's work with the first one here, okay? The rabbis, in their wisdom, subdivided the category of work into 39 different subcategories, which we can debate ad nauseum. But the reality is he is breaking a cardinal principle of Judaism. He's working on the Sabbath. Now, I'm not a rabbi. I'm not a halachist, a Jewish legal decisor. I'm a historian. What in the world do I do with him? How do I categorize him? And to make the story even more robust, when he passed away, the rabbi of the congregation visited the family during the Shiva, the mourning period, and told the following story, that their father, this gentleman who passed away, once approached the rabbi and said, should I wear tefillin, phylacteries, the religious straps that a traditional Jew should wear on a weekday if it's on a Jewish holiday, because I'm treating the holiday as if it was a work day. Now, according to a Jewish legal prescription, that's impossible. But to my way of thinking, he is one Orthodox Jew, because he affirms that what I should be doing is observing these traditions, and for a variety of reasons, these things get in the way. He chooses to affirm so many things, but America gets in the way. Having told that story, and that memory which sticks with me, and I have to say, as I've talked about this book literally around the country, people have come up to me and said, you know, I grew up in that environment. I knew someone like that. Or my students at yeshiva, I tell them, go home, and if you're privileged to have grandparents, ask them, do you know anybody like this gentleman? They all come back and say, sure, my parents or grandparents knew somebody. The truth of the matter is they're talking about their own families, but they're not revealing it necessarily at this point. Anyway, as I wrote this, I began to think that this is a common thread for the American Jewish experience that goes all the way back in time. And rather than say that American Judaism is emblematic of an ever-dying people, of a sorry state of observance in America, what we have to do as historians, what I've tried to do, is to nuance it and to see how this type of behavior, affirming and dissenting, rejecting and accepting, has been an ongoing religious value for Jews from the very, very start. And that's what my talk ultimately is all about. So with your permission, I'm going to walk you through 7 or 8 different sources of American Jewish history and see some of the patterns that are noticeable. I should say that when we look at the early experience of American Jews, We're talking the period from 1654 to the American Revolution. Maybe there are 1,000 Jews in what becomes the United States, and there's a paucity of sources that have come down to us. Again, look at the Asher Levy story. We know so little about him, it's hard to make a determination. And everyone uses the same sources to tell their story, but they spin it in a variety of different ways. So this is how I spin early experience. Document number 1. Rachel Samuels lives in Petersburg, Virginia, in around 1792. She writes a letter to her family in Hamburg, Germany. Please follow along with me. She writes, "This place is lacking in Yehudischkeit," that means Judaism. 10 or 12 Jews not worthy of being called Jews. She's a hard-nosed about it. They do not know what the Sabbath and holidays are. On the Sabbath, all the Jewish stores are open, as they do during the week. On Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Jewish New Year and Day of Atonement, the people worship without a Torah scroll. And not one of them, except her husband, and an old man of 60 from Holland, wore a talit, a prayer shawl, and the shachet, he's the ritual slaughterer, goes to market and buys trefa, unkosher meat, and then brings it home. Okay? So most historians, or many historians, say, well, this is a document that reflects the paucity of observance and the decline of Jewish life. Oh, I should tell you, the document ends with the following note. She says, I have to get the heck, she doesn't say heck, you have to get out of Petersburg, Virginia. I have to go to a place where the Torah really lives. I have to move to Charleston, South Carolina. Why Charleston, South Carolina? Because at that point, it was still the largest Jewish community, about to be eclipsed by Gotham, by New York City. By that point, I got to go where there's an established Jewish community. So I understand this document very, very differently. Because I'm a loose constructionist of tradition, I'm looking at the values of these people. So several things have to be said. Number 1, working backwards, it may well be that the ritual slaughterer is a crook and that he's purveying unkosher meat as kosher meat. I have to tell you a dirty little secret. It's no secret. This has been an ongoing problem for kosher eaters from that day down to the present day. Okay? And if you're a sports fan, I sometimes say that every 50 years there's a kosher meat strike, a kosher meat scandal, and a kosher basketball scandal with Jews being involved in both of them. But be that as it may, the shachet might go to market and buy the wrong type of meat, but he has a clientele that wants kosher meat. In other words, there is a desire to eat kosher meat within that constituency. So they get one big plus in terms of their interest in eating kosher. As far as the synagogue is concerned, for me, the most important thing is that when they came to worship on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they're coming to the synagogue to pray. Sadly, there's no Torah scroll there. They may have read the Torah portion out of a Bible. But there is a desire to be there. In other words, minimalizing this type of thing, it's very important. So I see this not as the end of the line, but reflecting some of the difficulties Jews faced in maintaining their Judaism. In other words, I think she missed what they affirmed, namely their desire to live to some extent as a Jew in a very difficult situation. Let's move on. We move on some 60 or 70 years. At this point, the numbers of Jews in the United States has gone from 1,000 to probably 50,000, on the road to 250,000. This is the period of the so-called German Jewish immigration, although they're not German Jews because there's no Germany till 1869, these are Central European Jews. So there's a traveler. His name is Isaac Benjamin. His travelogue in German, Drei Jahr in America, 3 years in America. He calls himself Benjamin II. Benjamin I, there was a Benjamin I, was a medieval Jewish traveler, Benjamin of Tudela, who traveled throughout the Mediterranean world and willed to us his memoir of his travelogue through Mediterranean. So Isaac Jacob Benjamin of the 19th century, he's traveling from Moldavia to America. He travels all over the Midwest and Far West. And here's what he says. The Jews are tossing religious duties and observance overboard as burdensome ballast. I'm not sure where they threw over their duties, maybe the Mississippi River, although it's not all that wide. But, no matter how indifferent and cold our fellow Jews are towards their religion, nevertheless, they are never so estranged from all religious feeling that it is a matter of total indifference to them where they bury their dead. You should know when you establish a Jewish community in a new area, the first institution you're to build is not a synagogue or a ritualarium or a pizza shop, but it's a joke, it's a New York joke because all Jewish communities have pizza stores, but a cemetery. They maintain that tradition. New Year's and the Day of Atonement still have some meaning for them. They might bake the unleavened bread of the flour usually offered for sale in the market, no attention being paid to the regulation for grinding flour. What that reflects is not a lack of interest, but lack of understanding about the minutia that goes into preparing the matzahs, the unleavened bread for the Passover holiday. It means that Sabbath they're working, but the Jewish New Year is very important. The Day of Atonement is very important, and in fact, the holiday of Passover, which begins a tradition among American Jews, Benjamin doesn't note this, that continues down to the present day, namely that among American Jews across a wide spectrum of observance, the three most observed traditions are, number one, the Jewish New Year, actually the most observed ritual by American Jews is a family meal called a Seder, the first night of Passover. Now, again, I'm not going to go into the details of what your Seder, if you're Jewish, would look like. Within some Orthodox communities today, there's almost a fetish of walking into the synagogue the first day of Passover and saying, you know, my Seder lasted to 2:30 in the morning. And someone said, well, my Seder lasted to 3:30 in the morning. My wife and I once had an occasion to go to our rabbi's Seder, and at 3:30 in the morning, I turned to the rabbi and said, Rabbi, this is the latest I've ever been up in my life without cards in my hands. You know, you play poker all night, be that as it may. And Rosh Hashanah, and the third most observed holiday, of course, is Hanukkah, which is a minor observance in Europe, becomes very important in terms of its concomitance with Christmas and the like. So here are people who want to eat matzahs. They bake the bread. It reflects a level of devotion to the tradition, even if they don't know all the details. Moving on. Any textbook you pick up about American Jewish history always has a larger version of this particular diary. During the mid-19th century, one of the ways Jews moved up in America during the period of manifest destiny is that they were peddlers. There are hundreds of turgid community histories that tell the story of the establishment of small and large cities, and the first Jew who arrives in town is a peddler who peddles his wares on the way to establishing the city. So this is probably the most famous diary of that time period by Abraham Cohen. He talks about thousands of young, strong men who forget their Creator, who pray neither on the working day nor on the Sabbath, having given up their religion for the pack that is on their backs. Sort of like our family friend 100 years later. One must profane the Sabbath, observing Sunday instead. Blue laws might restrict them from working on Sunday. God knoweth my thought. He knoweth my grief when on the Sabbath eve I must retire to my lodging and on Saturday morning carry my pack on my back, profaning the holy day, God's gift to his people. This is a fellow who is driven to work, but he feels a tremendous amount of guilt about the fact that he's working on the Sabbath. So don't cry for Abraham Cohen. We know what happens to him. He turns up in Chicago, Illinois, and he's the founder of the first synagogue in Chicago called Kihila Anshe Ma'arav, which means in Hebrew, the congregation of the people of the West. There's also corruption of the name. Sometimes you see Kihila Anshe Ma'ariv. Ma'arav and Ma'ariv are very similar. The community of the people of the evening service. But be that as it may, that synagogue begins as an Orthodox synagogue. When he gets a chance to establish a synagogue, he establishes a traditional synagogue. It's still around today. It's now called Temple K-A-J Zion. It happens to be across the street from the present President of the United States in Highland Park. So Abraham Cohen starts out as a diarist, as a peddler, and he does much better. Eventually, he establishes a traditional synagogue in Chicago, one of the first Jews in town. Now we move to East European period. If you're Jewish in this country, most of the people, your ancestors, came over during this time period. One of the most powerful homiletic images that's used by rabbis to describe the nature of religiosity has to do with what I call euphemistically the tefillin toss, the phylactery toss. And here we have a sermon, a portion of a sermon, translated from the Yiddish by Rabbi Moshe Shimon Sivitz, who came from Kovna in Lithuania, and he had a very difficult career. He was a rabbi in Baltimore, Cleveland, Toledo, and Pittsburgh. He bounces around. Not as bad as the 19th century Rabbi Bernard Illoui, who had 7 jobs in 7 cities and kept being bounced out of his pulpit every time the congregation wanted to move to be less traditional. But here's a classic homiletic image that I want to work with you extensively in a moment. He writes, Jews fled from God while still on the boat, who first stopped praying and then committed their talis, their prayer shawl, and tefillin, their phylacteries, to the deep. Unlike Abraham, our forefather, who left his home and birthplace, but who, instead of distancing himself from God's call, accepted the yoke of the commandments even more completely. While at sea, they succumbed as they saw their wives and children straying from the ways of their fathers. And the image he uses is that instead of where do they go, they use the story of Jonah. Jonah and the big fish, the large fish, which people say Jonah and the whale. God directs him to go to preach against what city? Nineveh, Assyria. What is the modern Nineveh? Nineveh is New York. Okay, so this is a very common image used by rabbis to describe the nature of observance on the boat. However, there are a number of problems with this image. Again, it's a homiletic image. It to some extent reflects reality, to some extent reflects his projection of reality. First of all, to engender this properly, at most, only half of the Jews who came to America could have thrown their prayer shawls and tefillin overboard, because the other half were women, and they didn't have those types of things to throw overboard. So what would you have them throw overboard as a woman's dimension of religiosity? I've thought about it a lot. Well, maybe they threw their candlesticks overboard. Maybe they threw their scarves, their wigs overboard as reflective of the fact that they're giving up their tradition. So one of the things we have to look at is the very different experience of women as opposed to men as far as their degree of religiosity and observance. Secondly, many of the men and many of the men didn't have their prayer shawls or phylacteries with them when they got on the boat and came to America. There are secularists, there are radicals, and there are some Zionists with broken compasses. Instead of going to Palestine, they're coming to New York. So maybe these people come out of the steerage, instead of throwing the Torah overboard, throw the writings of Karl Marx overboard, or Leo Pinsker, one of the first Zionist ideologues. Okay? Now, having said that, there are people who come to America who are resolute sinners, who in fact want to give it all up and do. And probably the best example is the type of event that sometimes took place in the Jewish sections of the big cities on the evening of Yom Kippur, known as Yom Kippur parties, Yom Kippur balls. Avowed secularists, it's an oxymoron, avowed secularists, but they're deeply committed against religion, would have their own parties with food and drink and all sorts of illegal substances on the holiest day of the Jewish year, which only indicates about them that they oppose the tradition, but they were not liberated from the tradition. Because if they were liberated tradition, they wouldn't spend their time on that day poking fun at the religious Jews downtown. In fact, willed to us are documents in Yiddish where some of these people actually composed their own secular service based upon the traditional service, but of course turned the opposite way. So what really happens? What's really going on here? Think of those candlesticks, think of those prayer shawls, etc. In most instances, they make it to America. They make it to the tenements. And they make it initially to the top of the bureau, of the chest of drawers. The assumption is they had a chest of drawers, but if they did have it, it would move to the top. Over the course of time, those religious objects would move slowly down to the front and then to the back of the closet. But in fact, there is a lot of guilt, resolute guilt, attached to these types of things. And one other point. I talked about people getting on the boat and not having these religious elements with them earlier on. The fact of the matter is that our image of East European Jewry in the 19th century has to be rethought. In other words, we have this lovely image of Jews living in the small towns, the fiddler on the roof image of 19th century Jews. Okay. Due to Tsarist policy, Tsarist oppression, one of the dynamics of the Tsars was to move Jews from these small towns to the larger cities of the Pale of Settlement and to make them more productive in a modern sense. So a town like Lemberg, Lvov, or Lodz, or Warsaw would have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews. And it's been said, and it's been documented, that so long as Jews lived in those small towns, it was said if you had a store that was open on Saturday, don't open it on Sunday, because no one will buy from you. But as Jews move to the cities of the Pale of Settlement, which is where most Jews live, we begin to see sources which indicate that they too are playing somewhat loose and fast with the tradition. So the breakdown of tradition is not when they got on the boat in Hamburg, or not when they saw the lady in the harbor in New York, but when they decided to leave these towns for the trip to America. Here's one source from the 1920s, from Lvov. The old-fashioned Frum Jews, religious Jews, go their way, and their modern counterparts go their own way, each acknowledging each other as actions of natural phenomenon. So I'm suggesting here is that Jews do not throw everything overboard. There's not a total renouncing of tradition, and in fact, in terms of gender, it's an interesting phenomenon. We seem to feel that women are more traditional than their men. So let's go back for a moment to these three rubrics of religiosity: Sabbath observance, kosher observance, and family purity laws. Reality is people are working on the Sabbath, more men than women. As far as the family purity laws, for the uninitiated, family purity laws mean basically that a woman in a certain point of her menstrual cycle has to go to the ritualarium called the mikveh if they're traditional, and then she can resume normal relations with her husband. That's what the tradition ordains. So here's what we know about that observance. Number one, since it's a private type of ritual, there's no way of determining how many people actually used it. But we do know that the Lower East Side had some 15 different mikvaot, ritualaria, which are used by Jews. More importantly, See what you think of this construction. We have in our possession, in Yiddish and in English, guides to mikveh use, which are published by rabbis and distributed to women on the Lower East Side. First thing it tells you, there's a constituency for these types of documents. But secondly, some of the things they say are quite striking. For example, one of the points that's raised by several of these rabbis is that women should not believe that if they take a bath in their home at the appropriate time during the month, that they are observing the ritual, which means several things. First of all, it means that some of those tenements had bathtubs, by the way. And by 1900, we have tenements with bathtubs. But more importantly, we begin to see that people don't understand the law, again, the details of the law, but have a commitment to observance. They say the proper way to observe the mitzvah is to do it that way. That's the issue of indoor plumbing. They may be foolish, but not intentionally so. And then there's the issue of men and their beards, which is sort of interesting. When Jews in Eastern Europe, many of them wore beards, not only because the tradition ordained it, but it was one of the ways to separate themselves tonsorally from the Gentiles around them. In the early 19th century, depilatories come into existence. Now, according to tradition, a man is not allowed to shave his beard with a razor. Okay, and I have a family story to tell you. I had a grandfather on my mother's side. His name was Israel Lerner. I'm named for him. My cousin is named for him. My mother had one story about her father that she sometimes told me, that our grandfather, who was very orthodox and a ritual slaughterer and not a crook, decided he wanted to become an American. So he went out and he bought a depilatory. That's like nair that women may use on their feet. And he used this depilatory to eliminate his beard. My mother's one recollection of that depilatory was that it was sulfur-based, and it stank up the tenement wherever they lived. That's her one memory. He was becoming Americanized. He wanted to fit into American society without violating the law. In 1932, a revolution takes place within traditional Judaism, and that's when Colonel Schick invents the electric razor. And the rabbis decide that this razor, this electric shaver, is religiously permitted, making it possible for traditional Jews to shave their beards, cut their beards, but in a religious way. Now, this may be a bit arcane for this audience. This is 1932. This rabbinic responsum is published in a Hebrew rabbinic journal called Pardes, the Grove. Pardes means a grove. The editor of this rabbinic journal, his name was Rabbi Pardes. He named the journal after himself. Humility was not one of his strong suits, but be that as it may, he publishes this responsum, says you can be traditional and you can cut your beard in a religious way. At the same time, the same year, 1932, a modern Orthodox English language journal called the Jewish Forum, which none of you have seen, and since I have no life, these are the types of things I look at, okay? Every month, the back page is royal razors. In other words, advertising the use of the safety razor, which is halachically, religiously problematic. What that says to me is that at this particular point in time, there's a divergence of opinion as to what constitutes the appropriate way to behave. And finally, we have the long enduring problem of Sabbath work. If you look at the bottom of the page, here is a line from a poem written by Ephraim Lizitsky, a poet who is an alumnus. RIETS means what becomes Yeshiva University. It's written about 1906. Ephraim Lizitsky became a very famous American Hebrew poet. By the way, there is no such thing as a very famous American Hebrew poet. They had a very small constituency. Most Jews read Yiddish. Here's the image that he evokes. He says, Jewish workers trampled with their weekday boots the train of the Sabbath queen's bridal gown. What a wonderful but sad image. In Jewish tradition, Jewish culture, the Sabbath queen ushers in the Sabbath, and the Sabbath ends with us escorting the Sabbath queen out. If you're Jewish and you've ever attended a Havdalah service, what are we doing? We're leading the Sabbath queen out. Here's his metaphor. As she's walking through the Jewish quarter, people are rushing off to work, and they inadvertently kick mud on her bridal gown. A sad but very, very poignant image. Parenthetically, those secularists would have kicked mud on her gown, but most Jews are not of that particular persuasion. And I can go on with examples of the problem of Sabbath observance throughout American Jewish history. But let me just look at the last document. Victor Geller, this is the 1950s, is traveling in New England, and he comes across a synagogue in a mill town where a line of men's jackets hung neatly on a long row of hooks. In shul, in the synagogue, where there was no one then in the building. He asked the rabbi, "What are these?" The rabbi says, "These are Sabbath jackets. They belong to the storekeepers who comprise most of our Sabbath minyan quorum for prayer. On the Sabbath, we pray at 7 o'clock. We are finished at 9. One last word about keeping kosher. There are financial and entrepreneurial issues here. In 1902, there's a very interesting combination of activity between Orthodox women and socialists, where there's a meat strike on the Lower East Side. These traditional women learn from the socialists how to organize a strike, and they march into probably the most elegant East European synagogue on the Lower East Side. It's called the Eldridge Street Synagogue. I've been privileged to write about the Eldridge Street Synagogue. If you get to New York, you'll visit it. They marched into the men's section. They marched down the aisle, and they stand in front of Isaac Gellis, who is the biggest hot dog and meat entrepreneur of the time. For sports fans, Isaac Gellis hot dogs used to be the official hot dog of the New York Knickerbockers. No more, because the Knickerbockers hardly exist anymore, but be that as it may, there's a kosher meat strike here. Secondly, some people study levels of kosher. I study levels of unkosher in terms of decline away from tradition. There are degrees of disaffection from the law. In the 18th century, a Swedish traveler in America, his name is Peter Kalm, K-A-L-M, writes in his diary that he's encountered Jewish businessmen on the road. And he notices when they are on the road, they're not so punctilious in their observance of kashrut. But when they get home back to New York, with its very large community of 100 souls, all of a sudden they become very particular about what they eat. This raises another particular dynamic of whether you can maintain your kosher traditions. Then a colleague of mine wrote a very interesting book a few years ago called G.I. Jews. It's a study of Jewish soldiers during World War II. I'll go back a step. Early on in American Jewish history, in the bad old days of our discipline, the literature was trying to document how many Jews fought for America, how many Jews were part of the war veterans, to answer canards that Leonard had talked about that Jews didn't fight for America. Now we look internally, but what does it mean to be a Jewish soldier in the American Army? She has a wonderful chapter called Eating Ham for Uncle Sam. That's the name of the chapter, in which she talks about how Jews who weren't particularly kosher eaters, needing to eat protein to be robust soldiers, had to make some very difficult social decisions in terms of what point in time they will be comfortable eating ham. Kosher style, biblical kosher, all these types of things, you excuse the expression, are grist for my mill in examining Jewish tradition. And I want to take you back to the 19th century. Probably the most important document of 19th century Reform Judaism was the Pittsburgh Platform, where they rejected much of Jewish tradition. 2 years earlier was the first graduating class of the Hebrew Union College. And they had what was known as the treif banquet, the unkosher banquet. The founders of Hebrew Union College invited traditionalists from all over the country to come to help celebrate the ordination of the first Jew rabbis in America. And you look at the menu, you see there are clams on the half shell, there's meat and milk together, there's lobster bisque, and all sorts of things. So I want to digress for a second. I was involved in a movie called God in America. It's a 6-hour film about religion in America. Jews, appropriately, got 14 minutes. I got 45 seconds. And what they did, in a very imaginative way, was to pair me with a good friend who's a Reform rabbi, and we did this debate, if you will, in 2 different cities over the course of 6 months. They asked Rabbi Lance Sussman, what's on the menu? He says, clams on the half shell, lobster bisque, milk and meat together. And then they interviewed me in Boston, and they said, Professor Gurock, let me walk you through the menu and whether traditional Jews could eat this. They said, what do you say about lobster bisque? I said, that's biblically prohibited. What about milk and meat together? That's biblically prohibited. And then they spliced the 2 things together, and it seems as if we're discussing it, we are hundreds of miles apart and 6 months apart, but it's in the movie. But the most interesting thing about that menu, Lance Sussman points out, is that what's missing from the menu? There are no pork products. No pork products. And he makes the point that pork carried with it ancestral, behavioral, maybe tribal implications. In other words, when we look at the Hanukkah story about the Greeks in Palestine in the 2nd century before the Common Era, you have the idea of the Hellenizing Jews and their Syrian colleagues sacrificing, having pork, pigs within the Holy Temple. And my line is, nobody ever threw a lobster into the Holy Temple. So to move that forward, it took Reform Jews a while to be comfortable moving beyond these tribal requirements or thoughts. Let me end with one final thought. I opened this talk about this gentleman who was very traditional, and yet he worked on the Sabbath. You might wonder what became of his children. Well, it turns out that the synagogue that I grew up with, where I sat near my father and near this gentleman, 50 years later, almost 50 years, 40 years later, I now sit next to him in the Orthodox synagogue where I pray in Riverdale. What does he do for a living? He has a PhD in communications, and he was the designer of Rehov Tzumtzum, the Hebrew Sesame Street, traditional Jew, and his wife, also a day school product, is a physician. They are as observant as their father and father-in-law were, but they are upwardly mobile, and more importantly, or as important as their own personal fidelity to their faith, they're living in a far more cultural, pluralistic world than our ancestors, if you're Jewish, lived in. And cultural pluralism says that Jews, who observe their traditions, rather than being weird, are seen as unique or interesting. And I'll close with a final personal story. A few years ago, University of Maryland had a conference on Jews and Mennonites. The Mennonites are like the Amish. And I was on a panel with a Mennonite. And he was dressed pretty much the way I was dressed, and we had this discussion. So he had this wonderful line, which I hope an Arizona crowd will understand as much as a New York crowd. He said, recently, remember, you know how the Amish dress in their idiosyncratic way. Well, he was dressed as a modern Amish person. I was dressed as a modern traditional Jew. He said recently he was visiting Borough Park in Brooklyn. As he walked around, he was surprised to see how many Amish there were in Brooklyn. It's a very, very different world from Asa Levy, very different world from Jacob Cohen, and I hope you got some sense of what the religious values of American Jews have been over this long 350 years of American Jewish history. Thank you very much.